So we proceed from where we left, and we had talked about homeostasis, and we agreed that there is need that our bodies of all living organisms are maintained in a particular steady state. It is therefore the responsibility of all the cells, tissues, organs, and organ systems that are found within the body of any living organism to try and maintain a very narrow range in which most of the conditions within the body are maintained. It's vital that those conditions are maintained within a range that is extremely narrow so that they can be compatible with life, meaning that temperatures can vary, but they've got to vary within a range that ensures the life of that particular organism is maintained. So in order for the internal environment of any particular organism to remain stable, it is important that continuous monitoring of that internal environment happens. So when the monitoring is continuous, then once it is realized that the condition has moved away from what is conducive and compatible for life, then there has to be an adjustment which happens all the time to ensure that everything is kept in balance. For example, there has to be a continuous monitoring for temperature, so that then once the temperature deviates away from 37, maybe it goes to 40, there has to be a constant adjustment towards 37. Equally, when the temperature has gone too low, there has to be an adjustment. Okay. So within these ranges, there is what we call a set point and there is what we call a normal range. So the value which is the physiological optimum, the desired value in which a particular variable should have as its value, that's what we call a set point. For example, we say the normal body temperature for a human being should be 37 degrees Celsius. That is the set point. Okay. But usually, as the body keeps to work in trying to maintain its homeostasis, in this case for temperature or any other variable, that particular value, for example temperature in this case, will keep fluctuating around the set point. So it will not be just 37, but it could be, for example, 36 all the way to maybe 38. Okay, so those fluctuations, mostly they are normal, and what is important is that they should not become too extreme. For example, the temperature should not fluctuate to maybe 33 or should not go beyond 40, because if they go too low or if they go too high, then they are beyond the normal range, so they are in an extreme value. Once these values have gone beyond that normal range, then they'll be working against life. In that case, for example, the high temperatures will lead to the denaturation of enzymes. Low temperatures will lead to inactivity. The enzymes will be inactivated. So in the case of body temperature, a normal range for an adult a range that is acceptable is between 36.5 degrees to 37.5. So it means if someone used a temperature to determine your body temperature, used a thermometer to determine your body temperature, and it's recorded as 36.4, 36.5, or is recorded, for example, as 37.5, that is not considered abnormal because it is still a range that is around that particular optimum value. So how is homeostasis maintained? Okay, how is the steady environment within the body of the living organism, how is that maintained? So in order to maintain the normal internal state of constancy, which we call homeostasis, within the body, for example, of a human being, that is done by an extremely complex balancing act. So irrespective of which variable that has to be kept within the normal range, the process of maintaining it requires at least 4 interacting components, one of which is the stimulus, the other one is the sensor, the other one is the control center, and the other one is the effector. The stimulus is provided by the variable which is being regulated. Okay, so the stimulus is the change in the variable. So that stimulus is what will indicate that the value of the variable has moved away from the set point, or it has deviated beyond the normal range. For example, body temperature. Okay, when your body temperature has gone too high, that is the stimulus. When the blood oxygen value has gone too low, that becomes the stimulus. Then there is now what monitors the value of the variable. Then after it has monitored that value, it has to send data, it has to send information about that value into the control center. So what monitors the value then eventually picks the change and sends that information into the control center is what we call the sensor. Okay, so when the body temperature has gone too low, when the body temperature has gone too high, okay, it's the responsibility of the nerves to pick that and relay it to the control center. What happens now in the control center is the information the control center receives from the sensor, it matches, it compares that information with values that are normal. If what it has received from the control center is not at the set point, or it is beyond the normal range, then the control center sends a signal to the effector. Control center is receiving information from the sensor. Once it receives that information, it compares it to what is it that is the normal value for that particular variable. Then after it has compared, it determines whether the information it's obtained from the sensor is either beyond the set point or beyond the normal range. If it is beyond the normal range, then the control center sends a signal to the effector to control that particular variable. If it is within the normal range, then it sends a signal to the effector not to tamper with that particular variable. So we've been talking about the effector. So the effector in this case is an organ, a gland, a muscle, or any other structure that can act on the signal from the control center so as to move the variable back towards the sweat point or to be within the normal range. Okay. So we have a diagram which is showing a model on how all these components interact to maintain homeostasis. As we've indicated, the stimulus will activate the sensor. Okay, so the sensor are just the sensory nerves, whatever it is that can pick the change in the particular variable. The change in the particular variable is the stimulus. Once the sensor has been activated and it's picked the change in the stimulus, it activates or it sends that information into the control center. Mostly the control center is our brain. Then now this is the control center that will regulate the effector. By regulating the effector, the control center tells the effector what to do. Okay, tells the effector what to do. Okay, so what we'll use here is an example of body temperature. Okay, it's an example of body temperature. So if there is high body temperature, then the temperature regulatory center within the brain will be activated. There are, of course, the sensory nerves within our skin that will pick information about the body temperature. And if that information has been picked by the sensory nerves and has now been relayed into the brain center, which is our temperature regulatory center of the brain, then the effector in this case will be the sweat glands. Okay, so the brain temperature regulatory center will activate the sweat glands, and as you sweat, the latent heat of vaporization is what will help to bring the body temperature down. So once the body temperature now reaches within the normal range, it was initially high. The sensory nerves picked that value, relayed it to the brain center. The brain center activated our sweat glands so that you sweat and your body temperature drops. Once it has dropped into the normal range, there is what we call a negative feedback, which will now be initiated so that the process can stop. Okay? So we look at two feedbacks. One is negative, the other is positive. Okay, so these feedback mechanisms, most of the time they work to maintain homeostasis, but it is the negative feedback that maintains homeostasis. The positive feedback, it takes something from worst to worst so that you attain a particular end point. Okay. In positive feedback, we are intending to attain a particular end point. In negative feedback, we are looking at taking the particular variable either to a particular set point or within the normal range. Okay. So that's the diagram we are looking at. The stimulus in this case is high body temperature. When it has exceeded, it's gone beyond the normal range. What are the sensors? The sensors are the nerve cells in our skin and brain. Those are the nerve cells that will now pick the change in the variable, the increase in the body temperature. Once they've picked that, they now relay that information into the control center, which is the temperature regulatory center in the brain. Once the temperature regulatory center in the brain has received data or information about the stimulus, in this case the body temperature, it will activate muscles or glands or any organ within the body to ensure that the change in the body temperature is brought to within either the set point or a normal range that is compatible with the life. In this case, the effector will be the sweat glands, which are found throughout the body. Okay, so you end up sweating, and through sweating now you lose the latent heat of vaporization. Then, as the heat is lost from your body, the body temperature that had exceeded, that had gone beyond the normal range, will now be brought to a range that is compatible with life. So let's look at these feedback mechanisms. So the first feedback mechanism is the negative feedback. So in a negative feedback loop, the feedback serves to reduce an excessive response and ensure that the variable is kept within the normal range. Okay. So processes within bodies of most living organisms that are controlled by the negative feedback include regulation of body temperature and the control of blood glucose levels. So because temperature regulation involves a negative feedback, it will either work to lower the temperature if the temperature is too high, or to raise the temperature if at all the temperature was initially too low. Let's look at the cooling down. So the body's temperature regulatory center is the hypothalamus, which is found in our brain. So when the sensory nerves that are found within the skin or the brain pick the stimulus that actually the body temperature is higher than the set point, they relay that information to the hypothalamus. Then it's now the hypothalamus to compare the temperature, the values of the temperature it is receiving with what is normal. Then if it is found, if the hypothalamus records that the temperature is actually higher than the set point, then it will set a few responses in motion. So one of the responses is that the blood vessels in the skin will dilate. Okay, we call that vasodilation. So once the blood vessels have vasodilated, have increased in diameter, they will now allow more blood from the warm body to flow close to the surface of the body. So once blood is flowing closer to the surface, what happens is that heat from the blood can now be lost into the environment. Okay? So as the blood flow increases in the skin, sweat glands within the skin are also activated to increase the production of sweat. We call that diaphoresis. So once that sweat has been pushed onto the skin, the sweat in this case will be in the form of liquid or water. Okay? Then as that water now evaporates from the skin surface, it takes with it heat. Okay? It takes with it heat, and that is the latent heat of vaporization. At times, when the temperature is too high, someone can breathe in a very deeper way. So breathing becomes deeper. The person may be forced even to breathe through their mouth instead of the nasal passageways. By doing that, because you are breathing from your mouth, you open your mouth, you breathe from your mouth. In that process, what you are doing is you are increasing even the heat that is being lost from the lungs. Because when you've opened your mouth and you're breathing, there is more air that can now be pushed out of your lungs compared to when you are just using your nose. So in that process, the air that is coming out of your lungs, remember the temperature of your body is what is high. So anything that is now leaving your body is leaving the heat that is within the body. Okay. On that, we have the diagram to illustrate all that we've talked about. So in that case, we are dealing with when the temperature was high. It has to come down. So it was the cooling down. But what will happen, for example, if the temperature is lower than the actual set point? So once the hypothalamus receives data that the body temperature is lower than the set point, then the hypothalamus, being the control center, it has to initiate some responses. So one of the things that will happen will almost be in the opposite of what was happening when we were trying to cool the body. So one is the blood vessels will contract, will undergo what we call vasoconstriction. So remember, the body is having a temperature that is lower, so it has to prevent heat loss. So with the vasoconstriction, it means blood is prevented from flowing closer to the surface of the body. With the vasodilation, the blood vessels increased in size. The importance of that was to push blood closer to the surface of the skin so that heat can be lost. In this case, the body does not need to lose heat. So it has to ensure that blood does not flow close to the surface of the body. So by doing that, it will reduce the amount of heat that is lost from the surface of the body. So, at times, when it is cold, you begin to shiver. Okay? So, shivering is due to signals that are relayed to our skeletal muscles. Those signals come from the hypothalamus. As those skeletal muscles begin to contract, then they lead to the generation of heat. They rub against each other. And in that process, they lead to the generation of heat. Because remember, your body was having a temperature that was lower than normal. So it needs to increase, to raise the body temperature. Okay. Then another thing that might happen in this case is stimulation of the thyroid gland so that more thyroid hormones are secreted. What thyroid hormones do is that they will help in increasing the metabolic activity. Once the metabolic activity within the body has increased, then there will be a general rise in the amount of heat that is produced in the various cells throughout the body. Because of an increase in the amount of heat that is produced, then the temperature of the body will do what? Will rise. Okay? That is summarized on the lower part of this figure. The upper part shows when the temperature was high, how it can be brought down. The lower part is showing when the temperature is low, how can it be raised. Okay. The last will be the stimulation of the adrenal glands to secrete adrenaline as a hormone. Okay. What adrenaline does is it leads to the breakdown of glycogen. Once glycogen has been broken down, it produces glucose. Okay. Then now glucose is used as a source of energy. So this process, this process of breaking down glycogen is an exothermic process, which means it produces heat. Okay. So remember, your body is trying to produce heat. So it does anything that can lead to an increase in the amount of heat within it. So there is the stimulation of the adrenal glands to secrete adrenaline as a hormone. Then adrenaline leads to the exothermic process, which in this case is the breakdown of glycogen to produce glucose. So glucose will be used as an energy source. But in terms of temperature regulation, the breakdown of glycogen to give us glucose is a catabolic chemical process, which is exothermic, meaning it produces heat. Okay. So that is the negative feedback with respect to body temperature, either when there is need to raise the body temperature or when there is need to lower the body temperature. What happens now to glucose? What happens to glucose in terms of a negative feedback? So when there is need to control the blood glucose level, then there are certain endocrine cells within the pancreas, which we call the alpha and beta cells, which are responsible in the detection of the glucose levels within the blood. These cells will then respond appropriately to keep the level of glucose within the blood in what is determined by the body as being the normal range. Okay. So if the blood glucose level rises above the normal range, then the pancreatic beta cells will release the insulin hormone into the bloodstream. The glucose level is above the normal range. What happens in this case now is there is need that the hormone which is responsible to break down this glucose is released into the bloodstream. Why is the hormone being released? So that it can bring down that value towards either the set point or the normal range. So insulin signals cells to take up the excess glucose from the blood until the level of glucose decreases to the normal range. The level of insulin was high. The beta cells within the pancreas released insulin. What insulin does, it instructs or sends signals into cells within the body to take up glucose that is excess. Once the cells have taken up the excess glucose, then whatever now remains is either at a particular set point or within the normal range. In the event that glucose has fallen below the normal range, what happens now? The alpha cells will now release the glucagon as a hormone into the bloodstream. What glucagon does is that it instructs cells to break down glycogen which had been stored so as to produce glucose. Once that glucose is produced, it's then released into the blood until the level of glucose has increased enough to reach the normal range. Blood glucose level is high, the beta cells release insulin. Insulin instructs or signals cells to mop up the excess glucose from the blood. Blood glucose levels falls below. The pancreatic cells, called the alpha cells, release glucagon. Glucagon, what it does, once it's released by the alpha cells, it instructs cells to break down glycogen. Once glycogen is broken down, it leads to the release of glucose. Remember, the glucose levels were low, so we had to find a source of glucose so that we can raise the numbers. Okay, perfect way of correcting what was initially low. If it is high, it's brought low. If it is low, it is raised. Negative feedback. It is working towards attaining either a particular set point or a normal range. Now, what happens when you talk of a positive feedback? Unlike a negative feedback, this positive feedback loop serves to intensify a response until an end point is reached. With a positive feedback, there is no set point, there is no normal range that is attained. Instead, is an end point which is achieved. Okay? So, within the human body, the processes which are controlled by positive feedback include blood clotting and childbirth. Let's begin with blood clotting. So when a wound causes bleeding, something cuts your body somewhere, what will happen is you begin to bleed. So what your body does, it switches into place the positive feedback so that clotting of the blood can happen, at least so that you don't lose too much blood. So the substances that are released by the injured blood vessel, the wall that was injured, that was cut, which was pricked, the substances that are released by that wall are the ones that will begin the blood clotting process. So the platelets in the blood will start to cling to the injured site. And once they cling to that site that was injured, they will release chemicals which will attract more platelets to come. So as the platelets continue to come, more of the chemicals are released and more platelets are attracted to that particular site. Okay? So you are not trying to attain a particular set point, but the end point here is to ensure that more platelets come to that site. The end point is there has to be a clot so that bleeding stops. Okay? Substances that are produced are the ones that are attracting more other platelets. The coming of platelets is what will now lead to the formation of a what? A clot. The formation of that clot is what will lead to the ensuring that bleeding actually stops. What initiated it was the cut, the injury at that particular vessel or wall. Once the injury happened, substances within the blood initiated a process that leads to more platelets being attracted to that particular site of injury so that bleeding can stop. the end point is to stop bleeding. But initially, there was a trigger, which was the injury. Okay. What about childbirth? So, this figure explains the process of childbirth. Okay. This as well is driven by a positive feedback. So the positive feedback will lead to an increase in the deviation from the normal state until a fixed end point, but not a return to a normal set point, as in homeostasis. Okay. So the process of childbirth will begin normally when the head of the infant pushes against the cervix. Once the head has pushed against the cervix, the nerve impulses will be stimulated and they will travel from the cervix to the hypothalamus in the brain. So in response, the hypothalamus will send oxytocin as a hormone to the pituitary gland. Once oxytocin has gotten to the pituitary gland, there will be more secretions into the bloodstream so that it is now carried to the uterus. Okay? The oxytocin as a hormone, which has now been released, okay, which has been released and sent to the pituitary gland, will now stimulate further uterine contractions. These uterine contractions are now what will push the baby harder against the cervix. So as the baby is being pushed against the cervix now begins to dilate, to increase in size so that the baby can pass through. Okay? So this cycle continues because as the baby keeps pushing against the cervix, the signal is picked, sent to the brain. The hypothalamus picks that signal, sends oxytocin to the pituitary gland. Then oxytocin initiates or stimulates further contractions. These further contractions push the baby again harder against the cervix. Then the cervix keeps dilating. Okay? So as the cervix keeps dilating, it increases until at that particular point where now the baby is pushed through. The pushing of the baby through the cervix is now what we call birth. If the cervix does not dilate enough, one, either the baby will die, ama hapo ndio utaambiwa kwamba mtu anaenda kuzaa through cesarean section, because the cervix is not dilating, so they have to open up the womb of the mother watoe mtoto. If the cervix is not dilating and CS is not done, then mtoto atakufa. Okay? So once the baby has been pushed through the birth canal and is out of the body, the cervix is no longer now being pushed, because whatever was pushing the cervix was the baby. Imetoka iko nje. Then the stimulation of the cervix stops and nerve impulses are now sent to the brain that there is no longer push against the cervix. Then now the entire process, because hypothalamus, the control center, will now tell the muscles to stop. We've not gone back to what was normal. This was a positive feedback in which a certain end point, ambayo ni mtoto kutoka, ilitakikana. Na huyo mtoto atakuwa ametoka nje. Then everything will stop. In the last lecture, I was asked a very good question, that what happens when homeostasis fails? Okay, so these homeostatic mechanisms, they work continuously. The importance of them working continuously is for them to maintain stable conditions in the human body. But sometimes they fail. So once they fail, then we'll have a homeostatic imbalance. So either a particular variable will move away from the set point, or will go beyond the normal range. Okay. So once that happens, then we'll not be able to restore the internal state. Once that has now occurred, the inability of our bodies to maintain a homeostasis, a particular internal state of constancy, then you can either have now diseases setting in, and in adverse of cases, even deaths can result. Let's take an example of diabetes. Okay. So in the case of diabetes, the blood glucose levels are no longer regulated. So they can be either too high or too low. Why? Because your body is not responding either to insulin or is not able to produce enough insulin. In that case, then, you now have to undergo treatment where you are given diabetes, you are given a diabetic injection, an insulin injection. So that is a medical intervention which will help to restore the internal constant state. Okay? So by doing that, then, you've been given an insulin intervention which your body was not able to produce. Okay? So what insulin will do, it will help to prevent the rise in glucose levels. Because if the glucose levels go very high, then they are likely to damage the body. Okay? So what that medical intervention was trying to achieve is to restore homeostasis. Once the homeostasis has been restored, then possibly damage to the organism, which might be permanent, could be prevented. Okay? So that marks the end of this subtopic. What we'll deal with next, we'll be beginning to look at now the various body systems. Okay? Begin now looking at how our bodies function with respect to certain systems. For example, digestion, production, okay, the integumentary system. So those are the ones we'll now begin to look at what makes them, what adaptations they have, and how generally they function. So listen to this. If you have a question, you can get to me either through email or using my phone number, which I think most, if not all of you, have. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the next lecture. Asante.